Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our Millennial Round Table, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about some of these Supreme Court cases. We've mentioned them, but we were really waiting till we had Chelsey in studio here as a lawyer. And, of course, Nick, we always love to get his comments as well. So this is going to be just a great opportunity to look at what the Supreme Court has done and what it plans to do next fall.
You know, Kerby, I've watched a lot of Law and Order to lead up to the show to prepare me for today. So get ready, Chelsey. I don't want to intimidate you, but I want you to know that I'm ready. I'm ready.
Chelsey does have her law degree. She, of course, is also Chief of Staff for First Liberty, and we have a link to First Liberty and to many of these articles and commentaries on this. But, Chelsey, let's come to you right away. One of the more important cases, and it didn't look like this at first. I wrote a commentary a month ago and said you wouldn't have thought tires and religious liberty would go together. But this has turned out to be a really important case, and it has to do with the Trinity Lutheran Church there in Missouri. Tell us more.
That's right. It's a very interesting case, mostly because, as you mentioned, the fact pattern is a little bit more obscure. It's not one that you would necessarily expect to get a lot of traction, but it definitely has. It's a case where the state essentially said, we have extra tire scraps. It's an honorable program. We want to recycle these and give them to school institutions, educational institutions. Everyone could apply. They didn't have enough for everyone. So out of like 45 applicants, they were going to give them to the first 12 or so.
Right.
And the church ranked number 5 out of the applicants. So the issue became more problematic when they decided to not give this church, which is a church school, the tire scraps or the government benefit because it was a religious institution. And the Constitution there actually had a narrower interpretation on that than the federal Constitution has, where you can receive a public benefit if you are a religious institution. It just can't go to religious uses. For instance, there's a case that was precedent, Locke v. Davis, where they said you could give scholarships to students who go to religious schools, but those scholarships could not go to students who were going to be specifically trained to be clergy. So that's an Establishment Clause violation. So we were a little bit nervous about this case with that precedent out there, not knowing how it would go. But I would call this a square victory in the religious liberty column, because it was a 7-2 opinion. That means they got two of the liberal justices on board, and Gorsuch and Thomas both had concurring opinions, which said that they would have broadened the majority opinion more than it was. But essentially, they said that this was blatant religious discrimination. It violated the religious free exercise rights of the church, because essentially they were denied a public benefit based on their identity as a religious institution.
I loved reading part of the opinion piece that Chief Justice Roberts put out. They called it odious to the Constitution.
Odious.
I thought that was such.
Yes.
I thought, one, just from a literary perspective, that was such a beautiful word picture to be able to give.
It was. Now, footnote 3. I don't know if our listeners are aware, but it's gotten a little bit of limelight in the news because it essentially said that, in this narrow context, this is how we're going to interpret this issue, and not in a broader context. So a few of the conservatives kind of balked at that. And then we think that it might have been a strategic part on Roberts to get a little bit more liberals on board in the majority opinion.
I've read that.
But I think the most exciting part of this, as Gorsuch's first religious liberty insight, he is as right as Thomas, if not more. I mean, they've been joining each other and aligned in all the opinions that have come out. And he gets it. When you go online, read the concurrence. I know this is very nerdy, but very exciting, because he essentially said that the majority's opinion said, well, if this had gone to religious use, that might have been more of an issue, like the Locke versus Davis case. And Gorsuch said, maybe not. I mean, maybe can you say that someone's identity as a Christian doesn't inform their actions as a Christian? He thinks we shouldn't be making that distinction, which, of course, all of our court cases that are pending right now involve that issue. So we were very excited.
And yeah, just from a theological standpoint too, it really is a win for us just to be able to see this is just a church that really is just something that we can just put up in the limelight, because they're really a church that's seeking to benefit the community. They're seeking to work for the welfare of their community to such an extent that they're providing a playground that's not just for Christians or for members of the church, but really is for the entire community. living out what Jeremiah said, to seek the welfare of the city and to provide a safe place, even more so, and not wanting a privileged seat at the public square table, but really just wanting a seat at the table to be able to go through the process, to be able to fill out the appropriate applications, and then to rise up to the top. And so they're not asking for privilege, they're just asking for a chance. They got the chance, and now the courts ruled in their favor. So from a theological perspective, it's a beautiful example that's worthy of emulation. And then from a legal standpoint, it seems to be a big win.
Yes. You mentioned Neil Gorsuch just before we take a break. I guess I'm a fellow nerd because on Monday I had Gary Bauer on for just a minute, and I said I'd actually read another opinion earlier by Neil Gorsuch, which was really kind of a labor dispute about a census worker, and I was reading that he and Clarence Thomas in that particular case were both saying, and Neil Gorsuch specifically wrote that as tempting it is to change the statute, that's not what justices do. This is something that legislatures do. So I was really excited about that. So then when you read this particular case, Trinity Lutheran Church, and read all the things that Justice Gorsuch did, and I read some of those on Monday on the air, Gary Bauer said, "You're pretty amazing." I said, "Yeah, I have no life." But, when you read this was a concern because though I'm the oldest one around the table, there was a time back in the 1990s when we were told that Justice David Souter was going to be a good, strict, constructionist, conservative judge, and he was not. And he was not any more strict constructionist justice, and we found that out pretty quickly. Well, I think, Chelsey, in this case, we can rest assured that when you look at Judge Neil Gorsuch, on two different occasions now, it's been Clarence Thomas and Judge Gorsuch that have been the remaining two, and in some respects more conservative than any of the other justices on the court.
That's exactly right. His first three opinions coming out the chute were a concurrence, a dissent, and then again a separate concurrence. And all three of them were extremely textualist in interpretation, which means for our listeners out there that as most good conservative judges should do, they look at the actual text of the statutes being interpreted and apply that to the situation at hand instead of changing it or revising it or adding to it, which shows a high level of judicial restraint on his part. And I think it's worth noting that conservatives on the Hill, our new mantra right now for these appointments is no more suitors.
Yes.
I have heard that time and time again at the Federalist Society events, no more suitors. That's why Trump's top 21, now 20 list is so important, because every single person on that list has a judicial record to look at, and they have opinions that are drafted. We know what their backgrounds are, and something more to go off of than a really stellar reputation.
Well, I do hear that your boss, Kelly Shackelford, has been evaluating some of those. I've also heard that some of your colleagues may eventually be judges, so isn't that incredible?
You never know.
So there are all sorts of possibilities. Nick, this is a good time to be alive, don't you think?
A great time to be alive when you've got law shows like Law and Order and Boston Legal. We've got great law shows to keep us semi-informed about what's happening, or at least entertained, to say the least.
I'm glad we've got Chelsey here to inform us as well.
That's for sure.
When we come back, I want to talk about the significance of this, because Colorado has what's called a Blaine Amendment. There are 38 states that do, and some people are saying this would also affect things like school choice. And then we have Baker in Colorado that's going to be hearing a case, and that's going to be an important one as well. So we have a lot more religious liberty issues. That's before we even get to the travel ban. So we got all sorts of things to talk about today here on Point of View. It is our Millennial Round Table. Dr. Nick Pitts and Chelsey Youman will be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In an earlier commentary, I talked about how Dennis Prager argues that we're in the midst of a type of a civil war. He believes the country is as divided as the real civil war that divided the states. David French argues that we aren't really in a civil war, but we're certainly drifting towards divorce in this country. I'll leave for another day a discussion of this intramural debate about divisions in this country. They both acknowledge the deep divisions America can have and will continue to grow. David French says that Americans tend to belong to their political tribe not so much because they love its ideals, but because they despise their opponents. He provides some graphs that visually show the way Republicans and Democrats view each other. Republicans see Democrats as close-minded. Democrats see Republicans as close-minded. The only difference in the two graphs is the fact that Republicans view Democrats as more immoral, while Democrats view Republicans as more dishonest. So why are the divisions getting worse? One reason is the big sort. I've talked about this in previous commentaries. Americans are more and more living in areas of the country with people very much like them. 25 years ago, about a third lived in landslide counties where candidates won by more than 20%. Today, 6 in 10 live in landslide counties. Another reason is media sorting. We listen to radio programs and watch TV programs that reinforce our beliefs. We visit websites that promote our point of view. The internet and our smartphones could be used to bring us together. Instead, they're mostly being used to keep us apart because we sort ourselves into various tribes. This is why we now see the politicization of just about everything. Politics intrudes into the political arena, but also into the entertainment arena and even into sports. That's what happens when we're drifting towards divorce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it's Millennial Round Table. Dr. Nick Pitts, Chelsey Youman with us. And again, we have a link to the Denison Forum as well as to First Liberty Institute. But let me talk about some of the implications of some of this. Again, a lot of listeners might say, well, okay, so they got to have some recycled tires for the playground. But there are some other implications because after the Supreme Court ruled, then it went back and also made a comment about a couple of other cases. And one had to do with this issue of whether or not you could have public funding for religious schools. Now, a little bit of history. There was what was called the Blaine Amendment back in the 19th century. It didn't pass, but nevertheless, a lot of states, matter of fact, 38 states, including Colorado, have those. And it was really an attempt to try to prevent Catholic money from going into the public schools, to keep public money from going to parochial schools and all the rest. But it does seem to me that the Supreme Court not only ruled on this particular case of Trinity Lutheran, but now because it sent back a case to Colorado in a sort of a do-over, maybe that means that these Blaine amendments, which have been a real barrier to any kind of opportunity for religious organizations, maybe some of those might eventually be killed off.
We're really hoping for that at First Liberty. As I don't know if our listeners know this, but the Blaine Amendment was passed. There's evidence that it was with complete animus towards those in the Catholic faith, which, you know, I think in and of itself should make these amendments undergo a higher level of scrutiny for religious discrimination. But again, I do hope that the Trinity Lutheran case will go a little bit towards helping break away from some of that tradition and letting the public know that any public benefit that goes to religious institutions, it should be on level footing with those that are non-religious institutions. Otherwise, it is facial religious discrimination.
Sure. You know, one of the things that you're starting to see is that even though this was a 7-2 case, some people have been talking about Sonia Sotomayor's dissent. Or if you get USA Today, there was a counter editorial by Barry Lynn saying this is dangerous because we might accidentally allow money to benefit churches, and we might allow religious groups and religious individuals to have religious liberty. And I go, yeah, that sounds like a good idea to me. But what about this idea?
Well, I think it's important to note that especially in areas such as as healthcare and education. I mean, government funds already do go to religious nonprofits, 501c3. How many faith-based organizations provide very meaningful and invaluable care to the most needy in our society, whether we're talking about halfway houses or homeless shelters or Salvation Army. I mean, the Catholic charities. There's so many charities out there that already do receive grants or some form of public funding, as long as that funding doesn't go to overtly religious activities, as long as it goes to maintaining the home, or the staff and programs that are there. So I think it's important to note that these are rights that have already existed, and we don't want to blur those lines, because we can't afford to lose the billions of dollars of aid and care that these nonprofits provide.
Yeah, so Justice Sotomayor said that this ruling would weaken the divide between the church and the state, weaken the wall, I think is the exact wording that she said.
There goes that wall again.
Yeah, so I mean, and again, this isn't a new concept. If we can stretch it all the way back to when it was originally coined in 1644 with Roger Williams in his letter to Cotton Mather, and then it was really popularized in 1802 with Thomas Jefferson in his letter to the Danbury Baptist, and now it really has reached almost like a crescendo today. But if we go back to the original intention, it was always to try to make sure that the wilderness of the state did not encroach upon the garden of the church.
Right.
And it was never meant to keep the church from being able to interact in the state, but rather to go back to what we've talked to previously. The church was meant to be this impetus for good, of what Abraham Kuyper would say in the 19th century, to extend common grace to individuals and to organizations and to entities, in order that not necessarily to proselytize them, but just to be good people, kind people and institutions. Because as our founders thought at the very genesis of the American experiment, is that religion tends to produce virtue. Virtue is a good ally to a limited government. And so religion, regardless of whether it's Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, tends to produce virtue in people, and that's a positive good for societies. And so we don't want to make that wall any higher, but we do want to keep the church, or we do want to keep the state rather, from encroaching upon the church, but we never want to keep church people from being able to interact in the state.
Back to what Chelsey said, you and I know your boss, Jim Denison, have looked at this, and it seems to me that in most cases, there are a few exceptions perhaps, I can't find them, the faith-based organizations are always more effective than the secular organizations, and there's a very good reason for that. Let's take poverty, for example. The reason some people are poor is not economic issues, they're spiritual and psychological issues. And by definition, the federal government or a state government can't deal with some of those issues, but a church can. Drugs, prisons, whatever it might be, it seems to me in almost every single case, these faith-based organizations are, first of all, more effective, and we need them. And so when we say, no, we're going to build the wall really high, and you can minister to Christians, but you can't minister to the rest of society, we're actually hurting society, aren't we?
Yeah, just think about, I think about here in Texas, Southern Baptist Men, the disaster relief team here in Texas. Anytime there's disaster, whether it's a forest fire or whether it's a hurricane that comes onto shore, anytime there's some natural disaster, Texas Baptist Men are usually the first individuals there. Southern Baptist, and again, I went to a Southern Baptist school for seminary, and so there's a sense that they're very much compelled, not simply out of duty, but out of responsibility and out of honor to God, to be able to do these things. And they're not just fixing the issue, but they're really looking at the holistic problem. So I think that's one of the more beautiful things, and it continues along the line of the Christian tradition of being individuals that simply didn't run away from problems, but really ran to the problems. This dates all the way back to the 1st century, when children were being left at the gates, and instead of leaving their children at the gates, they were going to the gates in order to rescue these children out of some of the rudimentary forms of abortion during that day. Rescuing children. It's one of the beautiful things that religion brings about, and we never want to sequester that in the public square.
You mentioned Southern Baptists. One of the Southern Baptists we quote in our article here, Why Trinity Lutheran Matters, is Russell Moore, with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention, which I thought was interesting because he said, no reasonable person would conclude that offloading excess tire fragments to a church or a synagogue or a mosque would constitute government recognition. Apparently, we'll at least have 2 members of the Supreme Court that aren't reasonable people. But nevertheless, the point is there are tremendous benefits, especially when you have a secular purpose. The tire fragments, don't know whether it's going to go to a religious organization, whether it's a mosque or a synagogue or a church. It simply is something that benefits individuals. And so this is why I think the Supreme Court rightly ruled.
I think that's right. I think it's important to note, even statistically speaking, this is probably one of the reasons George Bush started the faith-based organization initiative that he did, because he understood that partnership with these organizations, first of all, it allows us to have a limited government in the social realm. It allows the people to really care for themselves and to provide invaluable aid. Even in the state of Texas, if you look at foster and adoption care, faith-based organizations make up a fourth of that in the state of Texas. That is so many hundreds and thousands of children being placed in homes that otherwise would not get to be placed in homes. So I think it's important in the public sphere, and government is allowed to have neutrality towards religion.
And religion isn't asking, it isn't wanting a privileged seat. It just wants a seat. Like, we're not, religious individuals are not wanting the privileged seat at the table to be able to look at me first, but rather we're just wanting a seat at the table because a good religion, and whether that, so if we look at foster care, for example, I believe like 8,000 children that are in the foster care system right now. What would it look like if the 14,000+ churches in Texas, for example, really took James and every church in Texas took 2 children out of the foster care system? Imagine the amount of taxpayer money that could be alleviated from the government services no longer having to be provided because you have individuals that are taking their religious admonition seriously. You think about not only schooling, how that would be affected. You think about child protective services, how that would be affected. You think about the healthcare system, how that could be affected. Religious individuals really are not only, they're asking for a smaller government because they're taking on the more responsibility from a stronger centralized government.
When we come back, we'll talk about refugees and what the churches could do there. But I just thought I'd mention we're getting to the end of our fiscal year, which is Friday, June 30th. And around the table, I might mention that I just sent in my check to First Liberty to support them at the year end. And of course, consider what you might do not only to support these two, counter the bias against our values and bridge the divide that is growing in our culture. Give now. So again, your gift will be double because we have a matching challenge. So again, you can go to the website pointofview.net, or we also are answering the phone on our pledge line. That is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, which means your gift of $50 becomes $100. That's a good deal. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about a couple of other very important Supreme Court cases. We'll be right back.
There's a saying, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Setting goals is something that every successful business and ministry does. Point of View is no exception, so please listen for just a minute here. This week, we're finalizing the budget for the coming year, including things that we hope to accomplish. Some plans are on the bubble right now. They're at risk. When the fiscal year ends Friday, we'll know whether we can do them or whether they'll likely have to wait. Point of View wants to bridge the great divide in America, cutting through the fake news that some are spinning and also bringing you critical information that others aren't talking about. To do all we can in the coming year, partners like you need to step up now. Visit pointofview.net, click the banner Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. Whatever you give by Friday will be doubled up to $10,000. The hours are counting down. Please invest in a bridge of truth. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Millennial Round Table, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. You've had a chance to see some of these Supreme Court decisions coming down. I'd love to get your thoughts. We're going to move into some other topics a little bit later, but still, we have a lot to cover. In studio with us, Dr. Nick Pitts, as well as Chelsey Youman, and they're with the Denison Forum and First Liberty Institute, respectively. Let me, if I can, Chelsey, go to another issue, Trump versus International Refugee Assistance Project. And that was another decision that came down, which was significant in that ultimately the final decision will take place this fall. But at least at the moment, any kind of injunctions, any kind of holds and things of that nature have been eliminated, and that allows President Trump and his administration to go ahead and begin to limit entry from at least 6 different countries where we don't have very good vetting processes. So talk about what that particular case might mean.
I think this is very significant because typically the Supreme Court government gets a little bit of a fast track, obviously, to the Supreme Court over everyday citizens. However, typically they do seem have an interest in taking cases where there's a circuit split below, where circuits have decided on either side of an issue and they want to make the final decision, help with order and the state of law in our entire country, and then allow the rest to work it out. But in this situation, no one has actually upheld the Trump ban yet out of the circuit courts, which means I think there might be a chance, don't quote me on this if I'm wrong, that they might overrule the lower courts and essentially say this is constitutional. We know the president has plenary power over matters of immigration and national security, which means almost absolute power in those realms. So this is a bit different than a typical, I know there are some First Amendment religious liberty claims involved, but we have cases on point, especially Korematsu is our last reference point, when the president during World War II sent Japanese citizens to different camps around the country as a security measure. The Supreme Court upheld that and said that there was enough statistic and evidence out there that there were active threats, and that, in line with the president's plenary power, allowed him to make that decision as commander-in-chief.
Yes. Well, again, if you can put Japanese in internment camps, you could certainly limit the opportunity for some people to come from 6 different terrorist countries with some kind of executive order, don't you think?
Yes. And let's not forget that you don't actually have constitutional rights until you are on the ground of the U.S. soil. And so we're not actually infringing anyone's rights abroad. I mean, they have not entered the U.S. They don't have those rights yet.
So, Chelsey, help me understand. Now, there's also the provision within the ruling that they gave examples that if someone has a bona fide rationale or bona fide reason for being here. Can you help elaborate upon that?
Can you be more specific?
Wasn't there something along the lines of if you had a family relative that was here, you were able to be bypassed? Something along those lines?
It was similarly situated persons with close familial relationships, but again, related to just the individual. So I think that was disclaimer in there so they could still get Ruth Bader Ginsburg, maybe Sonia Sotomayor, maybe Elena Kagan on board, because this one was unanimous in that sense, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so, and again, you can't get unanimous very often in the United States Supreme Court, right?
It's fascinating because there's the extent that I want to celebrate the fact that we're upholding the Constitution, we're upholding the powers of the presidency, and I think that's increasingly important, and it can also be an educational lesson for citizens, for help us to be able to see the distinction of powers, where the Supreme Court is really ruling on the rule of the law, the president is exercising his powers, and so we're seeing somewhat of this delineation between the powers, which I think is a beneficial lesson for the American public to lead. Where I want to move us forward, though, is it's still not sufficient. At the end of the day, it's a temporary ban.
That's very true.
As being the land of the free because of the brave, I think there's a beautiful history of America welcoming in immigrants, that we're a country of immigrants. So the last thing that I want to do is to assume a posture of fear that keeps individuals from being able to partake of the beauty of the freedoms that we have in this grand American experiment. Because
that's back to the church issue, because as I've said before, there have been some people in churches that saying, well, we should welcome refugees, and I say, well, then why doesn't your church step forward and say, we will take responsibility from this person from Somalia or Sudan or Iraq because we aren't so sure about them, but to be able to assure them that they will have a place in our church or a place where they will have a job, and we'll kind of ride herd on them. We'll give them the benefits that come by living in America. If churches step forward, a lot of this problem begins to go away because you have 300,000 churches in America.
I completely agree. And I think this is important for us just to delineate the type of responses that need to be made. There is a judicial response that we want to uphold the power that's been delineated by our founders relative to the executive office, and then the kind of the executive office, and then the judicial branch. We want to uphold that particular power. But then we want to remind ourselves that the church functions best when it's the conscience of the state, not a servant of the state. In the sense that to secure our borders is increasingly important for the political response, but the church has got to be the compassionate arm that really does seek to the welfare of the city, seeks to welcome in the stranger and the foreigner, and to a certain degree that for some instances, because there's 65 million refugees around the world today. There's never been this many refugees. In Syria alone, there is 7 million people that are internally displaced, and the problem is significant. And what we know to be true relative to ISIS is they prey upon these individuals. This is a breeding ground for these type of extremist activities. And so for the church to be proactive, and that doesn't mean necessarily welcoming them over here, because to an extent, that's extenuating circumstances. That's just sheer amount of money that it would take simply to bring one person over here. But we can be the hands and feet of Jesus over there to empower organizations that are working to be able to combat that extremism before. Today, we're living in a very unstable world, and extremism preys and is fostered well in these type of unstable environments.
I might mention, too, if your church is interested, we've got 2 different interviews we've done in the last couple of weeks. Just type in the word refugees on our website, and you can hear some of the interviews and some very concrete steps that you could take as your own church. But I want to come back, Chelsey, to something you mentioned just in passing, because, okay, the 9th Circuit Court and the 4th Circuit Court basically struck this down. There was no dissension, and so in some respects this is a little bit unusual, because usually when you have one circuit court uphold a law and another one strike it down, that's when they step in. But in this case, the courts were actually, if you will, slapped on the hands by the Supreme Court when there was actually no necessary reason why the Supreme Court had to step in right away.
Right. I mean, typically in these situations, we would say it looks like they're going to be overturned. I mean, that's what we say. They could have left the circuit courts to deal with it themselves. I'm sure the government, making the appeal is probably another reason it could be granted. But I do want to point out two things. Fun fact about me, I was actually a volunteer immigration attorney for a local refugee firm here in Texas.
That is fun.
I know. So I have like a very interesting view on this, or not interesting, but maybe different view.
Please.
But I will say, I think listeners should remember that in order to get refugee status to come here, it's a high bar. I mean, we are not just allowing anyone into our country. There are a lot of laws in place, a lot of regulations in place, background checks occurring. I mean, multiple months and months worth of vetting of these individuals. And so be encouraged. We do have laws in place. This is an extra step towards those protections. And a lot has been made of Trump wanting to make registries from these countries and kind of more strongly vet individuals from these countries. But we have a long history of that in America. For over about 150 years, we have had some form of wartime registry for nations that we're at war with. Bush implemented some when he was in office. So this is not new. I think the left is trying to conjure up a little bit more scare tactic on this. But if they'll remember, is as little as 14, 16 years ago, I mean, we had some of these things already implemented in place, which is another reason the Supreme Court might say, look, this is constitutional and within the realm of the Commander-in-Chief's office.
Do you think it's going to be increasingly harder as we see these type of refugees or just individuals that want to immigrate over here, especially when they're coming from these war-torn countries that really, they have no background to be able? Like, I can't even fathom that.
Actually, I mean, it is a requirement that they have someone you can speak to on their behalf. But typically, to be a refugee, the standard is that if you were to return home, you would be in dire danger of your life, or your family would be. A lot of times, it's Christians coming from these countries who have undergone persecution, which I know this executive order allows an exemption for, because we obviously don't want to bar people who are currently in heavy amounts of danger in their homes. So refugee status is actually a high bar, but I understand how we've got to keep that bar high, and we've got to keep it
exactly,
standards in place for security reasons. And we've seen a lot of terrorist attacks increase in Europe. I think all of those statistics are you'll see go before the Supreme Court saying, unfortunately, London, Paris, Brussels, Germany, we're seeing terrorist attacks everywhere when these standards haven't been in place.
Yeah, and I think there's even reason to celebrate too for individuals like me that are always many individuals that want to see that compassionate side to immigration. Just even last week, for example, when President Trump, or when the court ruled that those Iraqi Christians in was it Detroit or Michigan area that were allowed to stay? Yeah, to be able to go over there. So
we got to take a break, and we got a lot more to talk about. As you can tell, we haven't even covered some of the other cases, so stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The potential for scraped knees has led to an important victory for religious liberty. On June 26th, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its opinion on the case of Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. The court, by a margin of 7-2, held in favor of the church. Trinity Lutheran applied for reimbursement by the state of Missouri through a program that would allow them to trade out their coarse pea gravel surface for softer shredded tires on their church-operated Child Learning Center playground. But Missouri rejected Trinity Lutheran's application. Why? Because the state maintained that it could not fund grants designated for religious organizations. The Supreme Court found such a policy to be rank religious discrimination. As Chief Justice Roberts said, quote, "The Missouri Department of Natural Resources has not subjected anyone to chains or torture on account of religion, and the result of the state's policy is nothing so dramatic as the denial of political office. The consequence is, in all likelihood, a few extra scraped knees. But the exclusion of Trinity Lutheran from a public benefit for which it is otherwise qualified solely because it is a church is odious to our Constitution all the same and cannot stand." I agree. No state official should discriminate against people of faith or the religious organizations they operate, based merely on their religious status. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll certainly take a lot more phone calls in the second hour, but I thought before we get into a couple of things that the Supreme Court will be considering in the future, and there is a very important case that comes out of Colorado which relates to so many of the other cases in First Liberty, I thought we'd go back, Nick, and talk about a case we did mention last week, and that was the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office that, again, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 8-0, because Neil Gorsuch did not have a chance to join it, but he probably would have. And so, again, whenever you get the Supreme Court unanimously agreeing, that was pretty interesting, because what they said is this particular band, which has a phrase or at least a title that is sometimes seen as pejorative, Nevertheless, that was to be allowed as a trademark, and that is the slants. Now, that's kind of interesting because it gets us back to one of the conversations we have around here all the time, viewpoint discrimination. What's your thoughts?
You know, it's so interesting just because it's encouraging that again, this is one of those 8-0 decisions that we can see that free speech has been championed and edified and not only enshrined in our founding documents, but edified with our current jurists. And so there's that component. And then 2, there's just the kind of unfortunate naming of the band. And while I mean, I've never listened to any of them, and I like to think that I have eclectic taste in music. Like I'll be fully candid. Like I listen to Taylor Swift. I really have enjoyed Taylor Swift as of late. I've been on a country kick, and my Tennessee friends would say that that's not really country. That's more pop country or bro country, I guess you could say.
Bro country.
But I like to think that I have a pretty eclectic taste in
music. But
music.
I've never heard of this group.
I've never heard of the slants before, and so it kind of goes back to what Voltaire said, right? Like I'm going to protect your ability to be able to say something even though I might disagree with what you say. And so it's this sense that, yeah, I've never heard of them. They're more than willing, and they should be free to be able to be called whatever they want to a certain degree. But at the end of the day, because I disagree with them, or because I just haven't heard of them, or I don't like their particular music, just give me the freedom to not be able to listen to them and let them sing the swan song as they kind of go off into the sunset.
You know, they have actually said that what they want to do is kind of revitalize that phrase so that it's no longer seen as pejorative. And, of course, we recognize how that is the case. There was a time when calling somebody an Uncle Tom was a positive in the 19th century. Now it's definitely a negative. So sometimes things change. Of course, it gets back to the issue of the Washington Redskins, right?
You know, I'm trying to bring back bee's knees. I'm
Bee's
trying
knees.
my hardest to bring back bee's knees.
That might not ever happen.
No, you don't think so? I'm trying my best in all of my text message conversations. Whenever it's appropriate, instead of saying awesome, I'll say that's the bee's knees. And so I'm trying my best, but
It's working on it.
maybe they'll achieve more success by bringing back this name than I am with bee's knees. But
Bee's
nevertheless,
knees. What about this viewpoint discrimination? That just sounds like a phrase I hear at First Liberty almost every single day.
Every single day. This is the area I live in. But I think, there is precedent for this. This isn't unprecedented. I think Westboro Baptist had a Supreme Court case that went up a couple years ago, where Alito actually was not necessarily in the majority on that one, where he said, there has to be some limit to First Amendment speech, and his mindset tends to be if it breaches on assault, if it goes towards the direction of violence, he finds a limit. But frankly, all of the other justices have consistently held, no matter how offensive, derogatory, or terrible the speech is, it's protected under the U.S. First Amendment and our Constitution. And I think this is particularly important in this day and age where we have, safety, trigger warnings,
Safe spaces.
I'm such a bad millennial. I can't keep track of all of
hate
this.
speech as physically violent and dangerous. I was just thinking, if you could take this case and take it to every university right now, Nick, that would be important.
Yeah,
don't
so
you think?
even a study by Pew that said that 41% of millennials believe that there should be some limits on the First Amendment because they consider the First Amendment dangerous. But then that begs the question of who defines dangerous and how do you rule on what's dangerous or not?
Right, and we have, public accommodation statutes are popping up not only at the local levels, but at the state levels as well, which will include limits on verbiage. If someone finds your speech offensive, they can sue you. And I think Iowa is an example. We had a client out of Iowa, Cornerstone Church, that fought this tooth and nail for a religious exemption, but that doesn't mean that the remaining portion of that ordinance doesn't stand. And so I do think in this day and age, it's very important that this decision came out preemptively, because this will be tested probably in other contexts, in the public accommodation context, the LGBT context. It could get to the Supreme Court where people are saying that's a hate crime.
Yeah, so we look at it from a theological perspective too, and I think about pastors, for example. And so our pastor is going to be able to preach a sermon on 1 Corinthians 6 that talk about a former manner of life, and such were some of you. When it comes to kind of LGBT, or is that going to be considered hate speech that could end them up either being fined, one, or in jail too? Like, is that the day we're coming to?
Right. Yeah. I think it's very important for listeners and Americans in general to understand that they have rights. These are your rights. They are strong. They are protected. There's 225 years of these rights being protected. Even the Supreme Court was unanimous on this one, which is shocking.
Again,
but
yeah.
you have rights. That just doesn't mean they're being tested or that the public truly always appreciates those rights.
Yes. Well, in just a few minutes, I do want to talk about some cases coming up. But this one, again, I think is important, Nick, because anybody that gets the daily briefing from you knows that these debates at Evergreen State College and Middlebury and University of California at Berkeley and on and on and on are really related in some way or another back to this idea. Because as soon as you say that speech could be emotionally or physically harmful, which is at least some of the reaction that some people have had to this unanimous decision, then you head down this road of safe spaces and trigger warnings and all the dangerous issues we've talked about here.
Yeah, so it's Pride Month, and there was just an example of this last week out of Chicago. So Pride Month, and you've got a gay pride march that's going on, and there were some individuals that had Jewish flags with the Star of David on there, and they're waving them in the air. And the protesters, the LGBT protesters, said, you know what? That speech hurts me. That hurts me. So I think you need to leave, which is just
amazing.
You just can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
You just can't make this stuff.
You'd never thought that.
And the reality of the matter is, if we transfer this over to the college campus, it's just increasingly important for college students in general to realize that we don't know everything. No one knows everything, and a part of going to college is that curiosity meeting aged wisdom, and for questions to be asked and wisdom to be sought. And the reality of the matter is, free speech generates these beautiful ideas that can either be tested, and proven to be false, or can be found to be correlating and corresponding to reality and be truth, which can be a beautiful thing. And just to continue to channel what George Washington said, that if you take away our free speech, we will be like lamb that are led to slaughter.
That's right.
So it's increasingly important for us to be able to protect, one, this right, and two, to be able to exercise it, but from a Christian perspective, to be able to speak the truth in love.
If you'd like to join our conversation, we'll open up the phones in the second hour, 1-800-351-1212. And I'm going to have Nick sit here, but I'm assuming he would like to head down this road of talking about what this means in the future, because we have this Christian baker from Colorado, Jack Phillips. They're going to actually take this case. And then, of course, you have what's happened in Mississippi, where they actually have a law that protects bakers, photographers, and florists. So I think that's going to be an important issue. So we'll see whether or not, as the host, you want to go down that road.
You know what? We're going to have to ask the question in the next hour. Would Jesus bake the cake, right? And
no.
There's only one type of chocolate cake in this world. Forget German chocolate cake, forget strawberry shortcake. There's only one type of cake, and that's chocolate delicious goodness.
Oh, well, we'll find that out. Nick will be the host, and I'll sit next to Chelsey, and we'll learn a little bit more about some of these cases. But again, we're coming to the end of our fiscal year. If you have not helped us out, June 30th is Friday, and if you've been procrastinating, procrastinate no longer. We need to hear from you. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, and there is a button there that allows you to make your pledge or make your gift and to have it doubled. And of course, if you at any point like to talk to someone off air, that pledge line number 800-347-5151. We'll continue our conversation on our Millennial Round Table right after this.
There's a saying, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Setting goals is something that every successful business and ministry does. Point of View is no exception, so please listen for just a minute here. This week, we're finalizing the budget for the coming year, including things that we hope to accomplish. Some plans are on the bubble right now. They're at risk. When the fiscal year ends Friday, we'll know whether we can do them or whether they'll likely have to wait. Point of View wants to bridge the great divide in America, cutting through the fake news that some are spinning and also bringing you critical information that others aren't talking about. To do all we can in the coming year, partners like you need to step up now. Visit pointofview.net, click the banner Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. Whatever you give by Friday will be doubled up to $10,000. The hours are counting down. Please invest in a bridge of truth. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Nick Pitts here for the second hour of Point of View, and we've switched it from the Millennial Round Table to the Millennial Takeover. How do you feel about that, and Chelsey?
I feel like the odds are in our favor.
I feel like the odds are in our favor.
2-1. You got it.
Here we go. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And so I'm joined by Chelsey Youman, and then by the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Kerby Anderson. And we are going to answer the question definitively now. Would Jesus bake the cake? Is what I feel like coming up in the second hour. Does that you feel good about that, Chelsey?
I refuse to answer that question. I have clients involved. They're going to be my scapegoat on this.
So I really am excited just to be able to talk about this issue, because I think it's multifaceted, and I think we don't do it justice when we just answer it. When we answer it from a one-sided issue, because there's the political implications, there's the church implications, there's the Christian implications, the individual Christian implications. So I'm hoping to be able to spell that out over the next hour, and then maybe we can talk about this Wall Street Journal piece that I read earlier this week about the rise in dating apps, which inevitably raises the question, Chelsey, who pays on the first date? Does the guy pay traditionally, or does the girl pay?
My husband still pays.
It was shocking. I was shocked. I was talking about this earlier, and we'll talk about it later on, but I was shocked earlier about this because I was talking to some friends, just because the rise of social media dating now has created this question about, like, who's going to pay, and then these social mores that especially a boy from Tennessee's grown up hearing now are being questioned. What is happening to the world today?
I don't know.
I can't believe it. So that's why we need cake. And speaking of cake, Kerby, tell us about what's happening right now in the Supreme Court.
Well, let's just talk about that, because I want to get Chelsey's comments. There have been some of us around the table, and I think Kelly Shackelford and Chelsey and others thought, would it be better to wait to bring one of these cases related to bakers, photographers, florists, when you have at least a certainty that the court case would be going in your favor? But nevertheless, the Supreme Court has decided to take this case of a Christian baker, Jack Phillips, which is not unlike the case that you have, Chelsey, out of the state of Oregon. But both of these are situations in which, in the case of Jack Phillips, 2 men, in the case of the one in Oregon, 2 women, wanted a cake for a same-sex ceremony. And in both cases, when they declined, they came under the censure of their particular states. But this case will go to the Supreme Court, and it will, I think, be a precedent that will determine what happens to bakers, photographers, florists, and all sorts of other individuals, and whether they'll be forced to actually participate in a same-sex wedding with their artistic talents.
I think that this is going to be a very pivotal landmark case for this. We have this newly created right, the right for same-sex couples to marry out of 2015. And from that, I mean, we have seen, reverberations around our country of the implications of that decision. And so these are new issues. They've been percolating in the lower courts. We have the clients out of the state of Oregon who are now going to be, they're up on appeal, and we're waiting to receive the decision from that case, who are also bakers. But if you talk to the clients, I think it's important for people to understand their perspective on this, because the clients, truly, she calls it artwork. I mean, when she discusses her cakes, she hand makes these cakes. She believes they're a creation. She gets to know the couples. She designs them based on her perception of who the couple is. And she truly believes it's part of participating in this very important day for them and supporting that day. And in the same way that she refused to make a cake for a divorce party because she didn't want to participate and create for a divorce party and send that message of affirmation, she declined to make her creation for a same-sex couple for their wedding. I think it's also important to note she had served this couple on many occasions. Yeah. So this truly isn't a question of denial of service at all whatsoever. She had served them for multiple events. That's why they came back. So I think that's an important distinction to make. But in addition, I know I'm going on for a while, but there is some precedent on this front. There was a case decided about a parade by the Supreme Court where parade goers, there were some LGBT individuals who wanted to join the parade, and the court held, by denying them from joining the parade, they had a right to associate with those who were like-minded. They had a right to convey messages that were in accordance with their own conscience. We have a long history of conscience protections in our country. So I think this is the next level of conscience protection. And we obviously have Hobby Lobby, which states that, for-profits can have religious beliefs and conscience protection.
Yeah, I think you bring up really two great points that are increasingly important for listeners to understand. It's that it's not a denial of service, that they were more than willing to bake a cake, but not necessarily for a wedding, because they were seen as almost like an endorsement or a supporting of that, because they're lending their artistic talents. I'm very unfamiliar with this because no one in the history of my life has ever said what I baked is an artistic expression. No one. I tried to make a chocolate pie once, and it turned out to be chocolate pudding with some scrambled eggs on top. So
you did it wrong.
I did it completely wrong. So no one has ever told me that I am making an artistic expression or this artistic creation based on that. So help us to be able to understand the legal rationale as to why they believe that their consciences shouldn't be violated by doing this.
So there's a few theories of this case. So the first being a speech component. So what I'm saying, where you should see her cakes. They are beautiful. They're colorful. She spends hours on the creative side of them, which is protected speech. Creation, art expression is protected speech. And so her right to convey speech that is in accordance with her conscience is a protected right. The second being her religious beliefs. So the Supreme Court is not actually, no court actually, or government entity is allowed to delve into the validity of your belief. That's not a standard. Actually, you're supposed to say whether the sincerely held religious belief is being substantially burdened. Her being shut down in business would be the substantial burden, the $135,000 fine, garnishing her assets before she'd even had a decision weighed against her. All of those are substantial burdens on her for her religious belief. And then the only way that the government gets to win is if they have a compelling interest that's narrowly tailored to why they would force her to be infringing on her beliefs. So it's a very high standard. It's a very high threshold. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court weighs in.
Yeah. So again, there's a speech component that I believe that I'm uniquely speaking and by my speech supporting this particular union.
Right.
And then there's also the belief that there needs to be a substantial, is this going to bring about a substantial burden?
Right. And
me?
because the First Amendment has, association rights, rights to speech, religious liberty rights, and then in addition, media rights. So that's all the First Amendment entails. But if you get two of those in one case, they actually call it a hybrid claim. It's a super constitutional claim. And so there's a lot at stake for this decision.
I would definitely say so. And so we're coming up on a break. And so there are a couple of things I want to remind you. So we'll be taking your calls throughout the rest of the hour. So if you'd like to call, you can call 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. I see some lines that have our phone lines have started to light up. In a shocking twist, people have an opinion, Kerby, on whether Jesus would bake the cake. And so we want to, again, encourage you to call at 800-351-1212. And then in the next 45 minutes, what we're going to do is unpack, because I think you bring up a really great point, Chelsey, is there's a consistency of her belief as well. It's not just that she's exercising discrimination towards individuals that are a same-sex union, but really is the divorce component as well, which is, again, from a millennial perspective, I don't know about you, but there's a consistency issue that many millennials are beginning to cause some hesitation and doubt. And so we'll get into that in the next segment. And so tune in with us, or if you'd like to join in, be sure to call 800-351-1212, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, in an earlier commentary, I talked about how Dennis Prager argues that we're in the midst of a type of a civil war. He believes the country is as divided as the real civil war that divided the states. David French argues that we aren't really in a civil war, but we're certainly drifting towards divorce in this country. I'll leave for another day a discussion of this intramural debate about divisions in this country. They both acknowledge the deep divisions America can have and will continue to grow. David French says that Americans tend to belong to their political tribe not so much because they love its ideals, but because they despise their opponents. He provides some graphs that visually show the way Republicans and Democrats view each other. Republicans see Democrats as close-minded, Democrats see Republicans as close-minded. The only difference in the two graphs is the fact that Republicans view Democrats as more immoral, while Democrats view Republicans as more dishonest. So why are the divisions getting worse? One reason is the big sort. I've talked about this in previous commentaries. Americans are more and more living in areas of the country with people very much like them. 25 years ago, about a third lived in landslide counties where candidates won by more than 20%. Today, 6 in 10 live in landslide counties. Another reason is media sorting. We listen to radio programs and watch TV programs that reinforce our beliefs. We visit websites that promote our point of view. The internet and our smartphones could be used to bring us together. Instead, they're mostly being used to keep us apart because we sort ourselves into various tribes. This is why we now see the politicization of just about everything. Politics intrudes into the political arena, but also into the entertainment arena and even into sports. That's what happens when we're drifting towards divorce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And this is Nick Pitts back with you again for the second hour of Point of View, and we're going to take a phone call. So Joyce from KBJS. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hey, Joyce.
Voice is familiar, huh? I have gay and lesbian friends, and we have little symposium things. I'm straight. They don't care. When they have their car worked on, they go to their own people. My lesbian friend who has a Porsche goes to a lesbian Porsche or a gay repair person. The bakers go to gay bakers. The photographers go to gay photographers. They keep their money in their community. They promote themselves without having to go out and stir trouble up. They're very happy supporting themselves. You know, the gay baker, the gay cake, the messed up car, the great mechanic, etc., etc. They keep it within themselves. They keep their money within themselves. They keep their pride within themselves. They do not understand what the hoopla is. Everybody has to be gay. Everybody has to be married. It's a conundrum, actually, within the community. I'm privileged to know these people and get to listen to them and talk to them, and I just simply do not understand why they cannot support themselves without the contention of bringing everything else in. And I'd like your comment, please, sir.
You know, Nick, I've always wondered if some of this was a setup. I mean, Jack Phillips was called Masterpiece Bakery. You know, I think most people knew that Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon were Christians. We do know that the photographer in New Mexico, they actually had one lesbian partner call in and pretend this was for a traditional marriage. Then they had the other lesbian partner call in a few minutes later and say it was for a lesbian ceremony. So some of these, I've wondered if there's some kind of setup. What have you found out? Anything like that?
I cannot speak specifically to the Klein instance, but I can say in general, we do actually have. There are pretty telltale signs when individuals call us for legal help. A lot of times it's nonprofits who've actually been set up by these entities. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe that's the possibility. So that's a question to raise, at least, and even if they did go to Jack Phillips for all the right reasons, they'd actually been served by him before. And that's part of the problem. They've actually gone for everything else, so they've been able to provide. And I think Jack Phillips said, if they come in and they want birthday cakes, they want graduation cakes, they want anything else, no problem. The only place where he drew the line was a wedding cake. So it's possible some didn't anticipate that was going to be a deal breaker.
That's true. And actually, this has come up in part of the oral arguments and legal arguments of the case, is that there was no actual denial of service. Any other event they would be happy to serve for, it's a service they don't provide. It's like saying, I don't do any birthday cakes, or I don't do any divorce cakes. I mean, it's a categorical service that's just not offered to anyone. The other issue that did come up that I think is worth noting is that courts have looked to see, was there actually a denial here? Because they were able to go, what is the hardship? They were able to go half a mile and they got a free cake in the end. What's the actual injury?
Yeah, so the optimistic side of me wants to say that these are individuals that have sought after the Phillips because they're doing their work with excellence, right? Right. And so there's that optimistic. The pessimistic, probably the side that usually overtakes me, is is the sense that these are individuals that are being targeted for their Christian beliefs in order that they might put them, as millennials say, on blast.
There are videos. I mean, there's one on YouTube right now where someone went undercover to Muslim cake bakeries and were also denied, but you don't see lawsuits arising in that scenario.
Yeah, and so I guess to kind of go back to what Joyce was talking about, there is a sense that from his telling that he's been given the privilege to be able to have an ear with a homosexual community, and what a great opportunity to be incarnational with a particular community. Very much what Jesus would be able to do, Jesus would do, to be able to gravitate towards the margins of society. But it also illuminates a part for Christians as well, as we're reminded to do good to the household of God first, from Galatians 6:10, of wanting to be able to support my brothers and sisters in Christ, especially if they're doing good works with service, in order that I might be able to support them in the excellent work they're doing in the community. So Joyce, thank you so much for your phone call.
Support each other. They can support each other.
Oh, I think I lost you, Joyce. I apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time I took a call. So
you did very well.
Hey, we'll jump on over to Terry in Alaska.
Let's take another call.
Terry, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Well, my thing is it seems to me like there's just too many things used to cause contention and heartache between people. If you don't believe what someone else is doing, whatever happened to we reserve the right to refuse service to anybody for any reason. You might not like the way they dress, you might not like the way they talk, but as a business owner, as a person producing a service, you should be able to stand on that right. My personal belief is, as a Christian, how can you reach the gay, lesbian, or Muslim communities if you don't interact with them in a peaceable way and show them love? But on the other hand, there are some people who just cannot make that transition. They have their beliefs, that's their beliefs, and that's the way they are. So if someone doesn't want to provide you a service because they don't like you, they don't like your lifestyle, they don't like the way you look, why would you want someone to perform a service for you? Because number one, it's not going to be the type of service that you would want.
Yeah, so Terry, just background on me. I was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, at St. Mary's Hospital, the same hospital as the one and only Kenny Chesney, who popularized the song "No Shoes, No Shirt, No Problems." And so, unfortunately, I've encountered some problems when I've tried to go into one or two convenience stores after a run and tried to be able to get a bottle of water or something. So, Kerby, what would you say to Terry?
Well, and he's got 2 points. First of all, there's kind of this philosophy that we used to have, and it's been lost now, of live and let live. You know, you and I may disagree, but that's fine. You have your life. lifestyle, I have my lifestyle. And a lot of the original kind of gay agenda was that, look, we're just asking for the freedom to get married. But as soon as they gain some kind of power, it's not only do we want to have our freedom, but we want to make sure that you agree with us and that you conform to our viewpoint. So that's the first issue. And like you said, there may be some individuals that say this is a great opportunity to minister to people that I disagree with theologically, politically, whatever. But I also want to provide the opportunity for bakers and photographers and florists, but also we're talking about counselors and doctors and pharmacists and all sorts of other professions where if we just have the heavy hand of the state tell people that they need to do this, then you're basically saying, as a Christian, if you really have any kind of convictions, you can't be a baker, you can't be a photographer, you can't be a florist, you can't run an inn, you can't be a pharmacist because maybe you'd have some concern about giving out abortifacients or whatever. And that's certainly not the direction we want to go.
I think you raised such a good point, and I'm really glad that you did, because I was going to raise it if you didn't. That our,
well, then I'll let you raise it.
Well, that our country, I've been saying this a lot today, but we have a long history of conscience protection. So I think we made a compiled list of this in an amicus brief in Obergefell. I'm sorry, not Obergefell. In the pharmaceutical case, Storman's pharmaceutical case, excuse me. And if you pull that up on SCOTUS blog or something like that, our amicus brief has, I think, 165 conscience protections since the beginning of our country. That is, if you are a pacifist, you do not have to enter into wartime service. If you are a pharmacist, in a lot of states, you don't have to provide abortifacient drugs on your shelves. If you are a doctor or a nurse, you don't have to provide abortions if those are all things that are against your religious beliefs. And so we often say that the exemption needs to just cover religious adherents. It needs to cover those who are conscientious objectors.
And I'm so glad. I know I joked at the beginning of the show that I'd watched Law and Order, and I thought I was up to date on some of this law stuff, and I'm learning more and more. And I think that's just one of the valuable things that Point of View really does bring out. It allows us to be able to be informed Christians, to be able to have a more fully orbed Christian worldview. And that's why we would ask you just to continue to support Point of View.
We're coming to the end of our fiscal year, and again, we encourage you to do so. We come back, I want to talk about some of those conscience protections, because that's also one of the other articles we've mentioned as well. But if you're sitting here like Nick and me, or learning from Chelsey, or learning from some of the things that Nick has had to say, I hope that you really appreciate what we do here at Point of View. And as we've mentioned before, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring these programs to you every single day. And you're not only helping equip yourself by listening to this program, but your gift is helping equip other individuals to take a stand, to think biblically about every area of life, to know how to articulate a biblical worldview, and even as we talked about yesterday, how to defend a biblical worldview. So let me again encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. I've mentioned that we have a matching fund, and so that means your gift of $100 becomes $200. Your gift of, in one case, $250 becomes $500. So consider what you might do, and you can go to the website, pointofview.net, or you can call our pledge line, and this would be a great time to do so, because you could call it real quickly and not miss any of the program. That number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
There's a saying, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Setting goals is something that every successful business and ministry does. Point of View is no exception, so please listen for just a minute here. This week, we're finalizing the budget for the coming year, including things that we hope to accomplish. Some plans are on the bubble right now. They're at risk. When the fiscal year ends Friday, we'll know whether we can do them or whether they'll likely have to wait. Point of View wants to bridge the great divide in America, cutting through the fake news that some are spinning, and also bringing you critical information that others aren't talking about. To do all we can in the coming year, partners like you need to step up now. Visit pointofview.net, click the banner Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. Whatever you give by Friday will be doubled up to $10,000. The hours are counting down. Please invest in a bridge of truth. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View. This is Nick Pitts, joined by Chelsey Youman and the one and only Kerby Anderson. And we're going to continue to take our phone calls all the way around the country. So being from the South, I feel like I have to have a Southern voice represent. So Dwayne from Georgia, are you there?
Oh, hey, how you doing?
Doing well. Dwayne, where are you from? Where are you in Georgia?
I'm actually in Augusta.
Oh, okay. So you just got off the golf course is what you're trying to tell me.
No.
Will Dwayne share with us your point of view?
Well, I appreciate you taking my call, but what I wanted to ask you, I'm not a business owner, and I was just wondering, is it against the law to refuse services to somebody if you have a business? I mean, I thought we lived in a free country. To be able to say yes or no, I mean, is that against the law? I just don't know.
That's a great question.
It depends where you are. If you're in a city, county, or state that has what they call public accommodation statute or ordinance, which says you cannot what they call discriminate on the basis of race, religion, protected class status, then it very well might be against the law. In the state of Texas, it's not. In Oregon, it's not. In fact, our owners definitely could not go into business again. No one will do business with them. So you can certainly discriminate on the basis of religion if that's the standard. But there are some protected classes: race, national origin. Religion is a protected class from the government discriminating. So if the government were to say, we're not going to provide this benefit or service based on a protected class status like that, that's already been decided by federal statute, then no, that would definitely be illegal if the government's the one making the decision.
Now, if Nick was a bouncer, for example, in a restaurant or bar or something like that.
Which, listeners, it's not hard to imagine because I am
I knew I set him up for that one.
Pounds.
He could say you can't come into that accommodation based on all sorts of other factors, including whether or not you had shoes or a shirt or whether or not you looked obnoxious or whether you were drunk, right?
That's right. You're absolutely right. Nick could bounce anyone he wants.
I am quite the intimidating bouncers, listeners. And so that's just another reason to be able to log on to the Point of View's Facebook page and watch the live stream on this and to be impressed by all the working out I've done in the past 6 months. That can be counted on one hand in particular. So, Kerby, you had something to ask?
I did want to get to something. Our listeners in Mississippi have probably been following this because you had a law that in Mississippi actually protected a number of individuals, and it was actually upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And what it does is actually say that religious organizations like churches would not be forced to use their facilities to actually have a wedding that they would disagree with. And I think that's something churches need to think about, what they actually have in their doctrinal statement, in their constitution. It also would say that religious adoption agencies would be able to decide how they would work, because they may say we only want to provide children in places where there's going to be a married mother and father, or mom and dad. It also protects bakers and photographers and florists. It also would protect counselors and surgeons. They would not be required to participate in gender identity transitioning or sex reassignment surgeries. So that is a law that came from Mississippi. We have a number of listeners in Mississippi. It was also upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So this one, along with the case involving Jack Phillips, the Christian baker, I think are the ones that the courts are going to have to look at, don't you think?
Yes, if it gets appealed, it will definitely go to the Supreme Court. But again, as I mentioned, we have so many of these conscience protections, especially at the state level, already on the books, that this truly isn't an anomaly. I think we're seeing more and more creative ways that conscience rights are being tested out there, and which requires more and more protections for those who are really strong on religious liberty issues, or states that are strong on those. I should also add that we're living in a world, this is true, where religious hospitals, religious nonprofit Catholic hospitals, they're being sued for not performing transgendered operations. Yes. I mean, you cannot have Catholic doctors and nurses who are required to, for their existence to even be allowed under the Catholic Church, they have to adhere to the theology of the body doctrines. And so you're asking them to deeply violate their conscience when you ask them to perform those services. Those are relatively new services in our generation. And so they require new, strong protections.
And not only like a theological, you're asking them to violate theological belief, but then just based upon the social science and scientific research right now that's talking about transition surgeries. And these transition surgeries are known to increase depression. They're not good. They're just not positive goods for the body. And so why would you ask a doctor to a certain degree to violate the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm, and to such an extent just for some social justice cause? It's just fascinating.
I do have a question for Chelsey about Justice Kennedy, because we've oftentimes said that the Constitution is what Justice Kennedy says it would be. And on Monday, I was expecting him to come in with a Hawaiian shirt and maybe just maybe head off to Jimmy Buffett land and say, I'm going to resign. But he obviously has not. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that they've taken this case about the Christian baker, Jack Phillips, and maybe we'll eventually take this case out of Mississippi. And he was the one, if I remember right, in Obergefell, which was, again, the same-sex marriage case, that said even if you were to disagree with their decision, you should have the religious rights to do that. What about where he's going to stand on this case?
Yes, Kennedy keeps us on our toes. That is definitely the truth, to say the least. But he wrote what we call internally at First Liberty Institute the golden paragraph, because he addressed this issue. He knew that he was putting America on a collision course when he drafted that majority opinion. He knew it was going to have to be turned over to the states to figure out how to deal with this newly created fundamental right. I think it's why he couched in Christian terms that are not related to, it's a fundamental right, not a protected class. He steered clear of that, I think, on purpose. But one of the things the golden paragraph said was we have to leave room for religious adherents who have very good, pure motives a lot of the times for their religious beliefs to have objection to this. And we have to be able to protect their right to discuss this, to teach this in their homes, and to adhere to their faith on these issues. It's something the left likes to ignore, but we have millennia old, every single culture for millennia, every single religion for millennia have adhered to these beliefs. And so to say that that's all driven by animus, I think is absurdity.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think back just to the genesis of the American experiment, it was the religious individuals that were ones that started the hospitals. It was the religious individuals that were one that started the orphanages. It was religious individuals that were the ones that started the educational institutions and universities. And so to discount religious individuals based upon some sneer, it's just intellectually dishonest, to say the very least. And so, speaking of, not really, transitioning to the next phone call, Roderick from Texas, you're live on Point of View.
Yeah, how you doing out there?
Doing well. How are you?
Oh, doing good. Maybe better, not deserved.
Oh, good to hear.
Hey, I was kind of calling about the cake issue. If there's any one kind of cake, it's got to be angel food cake.
Roderick, yeah, I'm sorry you're losing connection right now. You're losing connection.
My husband would agree with you, Roger.
Yes.
Chocolate's way too close to devil's food cake.
It would be the devil, especially after what it does to my waist. But what's your point of view, Roger?
But anyway, yeah, in the Chick-fil-A case, I think the gay community, or they were kind of wanting to band together to boycott them. So you would certainly think that some fellow that doesn't want to make a cake for them, they'd want to boycott him too. And I would think that this is just to try to impose their beliefs on other people, really. And I guess that's my biggest problem with the whole gay thing, is they're trying to normalize it or make it to where it's accepted and should be promoted. And I mean, if somebody chooses to be gay or is gay or whatever, that's their prerogative, but I don't think it should be something that's promoted or pushed on other people, because in particular our nation's supposed to be one under God. And I don't think a gay person's any worse than a whoremonger or, anything else. I mean, I think God sees it all as sin, but the fact that it seems like we're in a position where we're kind of promoting it, I have kind of a big problem with that.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point, Roderick, in the sense that God has given us a certain amount of liberty. And in that liberty, we're going to be celebrating the 4th of July coming up. 241 years of America just being able to exercise that liberty. And today, that liberty has given us a diversity of beliefs, as we've been hearing for the past hour and 45 minutes, of just individuals that have kind of exercised those beliefs in a way that some are God-honoring and some that God still is pursuing after them, though they are apparently running away from him. And so one of the opportunities in this liberty-minded and just this liberty society is the opportunity to be able to share that good message of Jesus, the one that has come to set the captives free. And so we want to continue to promote that liberty and the freedom, but also allow us the opportunity to be able to give that message of peace, as well as true freedom in Christ. And so we'll continue to take your phone calls, but we're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The potential for scraped knees has led to an important victory for religious liberty. On June 26th, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its opinion on the case of Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. The court, by a margin of 7-2, held in favor of the church. Trinity Lutheran applied for reimbursement by the state of Missouri through a program that would allow them to trade out their coarse pea gravel surface for softer, shredded tires on their church-operated Child Learning Center playground. But Missouri rejected Trinity Lutheran's application. Why? Because the state maintained that it could not fund grants designated for religious organizations. The Supreme Court found such a policy to be rank religious discrimination. As Chief Justice Roberts said, quote, "The Missouri Department of Natural Resources has not subjected anyone to chains or torture on account of religion, and the result of the state's policy is nothing so dramatic as the denial of political office. The consequence is, in all likelihood, a few extra scraped knees. But the exclusion of Trinity Lutheran from a public benefit for which it is otherwise qualified, solely because it is a church, is odious to our Constitution all the same, and cannot stand." I agree. No state official should discriminate against people of faith or the religious organizations they operate, based merely on their religious status. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Point of View, back for the last 9 minutes and 7 seconds. I am your guest host, Nick Pitts, and I'm joined by Kerby Anderson and Chelsey Youman. And can you believe it? We've made it this far, though.
You've done so well.
Man,
and you have taken 4 phone calls so far.
I feel like we need to set the record straight one more time, because Roderick gave us some wrong advice about angel food cake.
Oh, those are good. Those are good too.
I'm more than willing,
live and let live.
Because of my chocolate cake affinity, I'm more than willing to allow red velvet cake.
Red velvet counts as chocolate. It does.
I'm willing to let that in, but I just am.
But not German chocolate.
I'm a little concerned. No German chocolate. I'm a little concerned about this angel food cake, simply because the reason that angel food cake often has to be accompanied by some fruit. And fruit totally null and voids any type of
I agree completely.
If I'm eating
and ice cream, usually.
If I'm eating dessert, the last thing I want to do is try to make it healthy, because then I'm like straddling the fence. Jesus might say I was being lukewarm, and Jesus spits lukewarm. Did you see how I eisegeted that text right there? I've taken it out of context.
Yes, you certainly did.
But nevertheless, I don't want to take anyone else out of context, so I'm gonna send it over to Helen in Maryland. Helen, are you there?
Please. Yes. My opinion on this thing with the gentleman who has the bakery, and he's being kind of forced into dealing with people of a different faith than his.
Yeah.
And I just don't feel that it is right.
Sure. And we're having a little trouble with that, but maybe she's talking about, again, being forced to take, and do those kinds of things. I mean, again, that's back to conscious protections, isn't it, Chelsey? I mean, you wouldn't force a vegetarian restaurant to serve meat. You wouldn't force a Muslim that owned a restaurant to serve pork, and yet we force right now in some of these states individuals to bake a cake for somebody that wants to have a ceremony that is actually just antithetical to their religious beliefs.
Right. I think that it's a really fine distinguishment to make, but it's worth making so that you would be able to convey listeners the same idea and principle to others who don't quite understand what we're saying on this issue. The fine line between what people call discrimination, which is saying, I'm not serving you as a person because of your personhood. We've seen that play out in the race instance. That is not what this is. This is categorically different. This is saying, I do not want to participate in a wedding ceremony. Now, if this was a restaurant owner just saying, I'm not going to serve someone because they're LGBT, that is different than saying, this would require me to actively participate and thereby affirm a wedding ceremony that is against my religious beliefs. And I feel like I would be participating in that. And that is a matter of conscience to that person. There's a difference.
There is a difference. And so this brings me up to our final topic. We're going to transition away from kind of the religious liberty and the freedom of conscience to something maybe not as significant, but definitely being talked about. And it was all stemmed from a Wall Street Journal article that really did. We're living in a brand new world, Kerby. We've talked about this time and again with
this is a millennial topic,
this
for sure.
This is a millennial topic.
Yes.
And so the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday, or I guess the article came out on Monday, raised the question as to who pays on the first date. Chelsey, who pays on the first date?
Always the man. Always the man. I don't want to say I adhere to the rules or anything, but there are societal norms that I think should be maintained.
Well, so let's give some background or information on this. A large part of the article was stemming from the fact that we have this rise of dating apps that have given rise to just this empowerment on both the men and the women's side. And so I've done some research on Tinder, and it's just been very interesting. So Tinder is probably the largest dating app that right now has just captured the imagination. And on Tinder, you log onto your phone, you get onto Tinder, and you're presented with a picture and a little bit of biography. And with this, you have the ability to either swipe right, and if you swipe right, you like the person. If you swipe left, you don't like the person. If you swipe right and they swipe right on your picture, you get a connection, and it opens up the opportunity for you two to be able to communicate via text message within the app. Well, here's the scale of Tinder, and this is what I found shocking, Chelsey.
Yes.
The scale is there are 1 billion swipes per day on Tinder.
That is a lot of dates. That's a lot of dates and not a lot of marriage. That's what I'm hearing.
Okay, so let's spell this out even further. Of the 1 billion swipes every day on Tinder, 988 million of those swipes are rejections. Rejections. That is a level of rejection that only Hillary
Clinton. People on
Clinton
Tinder right now do not want to know that.
No, that sounds like me in junior high. That's what it really sounds like.
And so the average user on Tinder is spending anywhere from 52 to 56 minutes per day on Tinder, on an average of 11 sessions per day. So they're getting onto the app 11 times. But this has raised the question now that there's just so many implications to this. And so probably my favorite sociological implication is it's produced what's called the stud effect in individuals. And so I've experienced this greatly. It's called rejection. And so rejection has a way, because there used to be a time before dating apps that you would go into these social settings, whether it was a restaurant, whether it was a church fellowship, and you were intimately acquainted with the fact that you could be rejected. And rejection produces humility, knowing that I'm not the best person, or I'm not the most well-liked person in this. And it creates a humility. Well, on this dating app, Tinder, for example, and most other dating apps, you don't know how many times people say no to you.
Until you gave the statistic right now. They're all being made aware.
And so you don't have that humiliating factor that's come about, that humbling component to it. And so you have a false sense of bravado when you walk into these fellowship halls or these bars or these restaurants, and it's created what's known as the stud effect. which in turn has raised the question now now that I'm the stud, quote unquote, does the man still have to pay on the day? I mean, feminist empowerment. I mean, I'm just saying.
There we go.
It's a little too much empowerment. But no, I have a lot of friends who are living this world real time right now. And the biggest frustration is not picking up the phone to call, a lack of initiative. I mean, we are seeing a change in dating culture that's frustrating to most women who, not just because they're traditional, but because they want men to rise to the occasion and show interest and show initiation. And that's just not happening as much anymore.
You know, it's so fascinating what's happening because, I mean, we're even seeing it. So, for example, just the sheer dominance in what technology is doing, the efficiencies it's creating in the marketplace, but also how it's changing the human person. One, with dating, for example, there used to be a generation that you just kind of, you kind of dated and eventually married the person that was just right beside you, close proximity to you, because you didn't have the communication means to be able to keep up some of those. And now we're even seeing the implications as well of now they're waiting longer and the pool is
weighing
bigger.
so many options.
Yeah.
It seems a little exhausting.
Yeah, you're telling me. It's very exhausting. So just so our listeners know, I'm going to go ahead and I'm falling on the side of the man always pays. Just to take away any mystery whatsoever. The Tennessee, my mom, my dad, and my grandparents in my ear right now. Of course, the man pays. He opens the door, he walks on that side of the sidewalk, et cetera, et cetera.
Might just mention that next week you will be the host of the Millennial Round Table for all 2 hours, and you can bring this back again and see what Allie Beth Stuckey says. Bring Chelsey back, and you can have an ongoing conflict, I would imagine, on that one.
I feel good about that, but I also feel daunted by that because two strong women. So.
Well, just before we wind down the program today, didn't Nick do a good job? We'd love to get your comments about that, but I also would encourage you to take the time, since we're coming to the last few days. We're about ready to wind down our fiscal year, and we certainly do need to hear from you. So if you haven't visited the website, we have an opportunity for you to click on a button there and have your actual donation to Point of View doubled, and because we have a matching fund. And so again, if you appreciate what we've done to equip you and to also equip so many other individuals in our country, please take the time to visit the website pointofview.net. Or even though we're going off the air, we'll still take phone calls from our pledge line. That would be a good time to talk to someone off air, 800-347-5151. I want to thank Andrew, Elisa, and everyone else who's been a part of this program. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
There's a saying, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Setting goals is something that every successful business and ministry does. Point of View is no exception, so please listen for just a minute here. This week, we're finalizing the budget for the coming year, including things that we hope to accomplish. Some plans are on the bubble right now. They're at risk. When the fiscal year ends Friday, we'll know whether we can do them or whether they'll likely have to wait. Point of View wants to bridge the great divide in America, cutting through the fake news that some are spinning and also bringing you critical information that others aren't talking about. To do all we can in the coming year, partners like you need to step up now. Visit pointofview.net, click the banner Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. Whatever you give by Friday will be doubled up to $10,000. The hours are counting down. Please invest in a bridge of truth. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.